They laughed when she said her mother was the President of the United States. The hearing was supposed to be a quiet intervention, a private meeting with counselors and perhaps a concerned teacher or two. But somehow, 200 people had packed themselves into the Vancouver School District Civic Hall to watch a 10-year-old girl be corrected. Abby Taylor sat alone at a long wooden table, her feet dangling above the floor, her hands folded so tight her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, a banner stretched across the stage reading Student Behavioral Review, but everyone in that room knew this had become something else entirely. The superintendent stood at the front, holding Abby's handwritten essay in the air like it was evidence of a crime. He read the line that had brought them all here, the line about her mother being not just president, but a Democrat, and the room responded exactly as rooms like that always do. Laughter. First nervous, then certain, then cruel. Someone in the back didn't bother to whisper when they called her delusional. Someone else said the word troubled. Phones came out. Red lights blinked. This was no longer a welfare check. What had started as concern for a child had become a public trial, and no one in that room knew about the black SUVs lining up outside, the agents adjusting their earpieces in the hallway, or the woman in white already standing silently at the back of the building. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button right now. Why? Because each like tells YouTube this story is worth sharing with someone who might really need it today. Drop a comment and let me know, where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss a story when it drops. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you help us build a space where real stories bring real hope. Now, let's go back to that room. The Civic Hall smelled like floor polish and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow. Rows of folding chairs had been dragged in to accommodate the crowd. Parents, teachers, school board members, a local councilman who had no business being there but had shown up anyway with a notebook and a look of righteous anticipation. And in front of them all, at a table meant for adults, sat Abby. She was 10 years old. Small for her age. Brown skin. Box braids pulled back with a white ribbon. She wore her favorite dress, the pale yellow one with tiny flowers, because her grandmother had told her to always dress with dignity when facing people who wanted to make her feel small. Her essay sat in the superintendent's hand like an accusation. She had written it for a class assignment, someone you admire, and she had written about her mother. She wrote about the long nights and the phone calls that came at strange hours. She wrote about the way her mother spoke to rooms full of people and made them listen. She wrote in the proud, unguarded handwriting of a child who believed in the truth, that her mother was the President of the United States. The class had laughed when she read it aloud. The teacher had pulled her aside. The counselor had made a phone call. And now somehow, Abby was here, in front of 200 strangers who had already made up their minds. The superintendent cleared his throat and read from the essay again. His voice carried the kind of theatrical disappointment that adults use when they want to sound kind but intend to wound. The room chuckled again. Someone murmured the word fantasy. Someone else said sad case. Abby did not cry. Not yet. Her mother had taught her something once, during one of those rare weekends they spent together, when schedules cleared and the world briefly let them be a normal family. She had said that silence, when used at the right time, was louder than shouting. That stillness could outlast chaos. So Abby sat still. Hands folded. Eyes forward. Waiting. She didn't know exactly what she was waiting for. But somewhere deep in her chest, the same place where she kept her prayers and her stubborn belief that she wasn't crazy, she felt something shift. Outside, beyond the heavy double doors, engines idled low and steady. Car doors closed softly, one after another. Men in dark suits stepped onto the curb and adjusted their earpieces, scanning the building with eyes trained to see everything and reveal nothing. And at the back of the hall, unnoticed by the crowd still shaking their heads at a little girl's impossible claim, a woman stepped through a side entrance. She wore white. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was calm, unreadable, deliberate. She said nothing. She didn't have to. She simply watched, and waited. At the front of the room, the superintendent adjusted his glasses and moved to the next phase of the hearing. He gestured toward the school psychologist, who stepped forward with a folder and a gentle, rehearsed expression. It was time, they said, to help Abby understand the difference between what was real and what she only wished was true. What followed was not an intervention. It was an unraveling, a careful clinical dismantling of everything Abby believed. They called it care. They called it correction. But as the psychologist opened her folder and the adults leaned in with their theories and their certainties, not one of them noticed the stillness settling over the back of the room, or the woman in white taking one step closer. The psychologist's name was Dr. Elaine Marsh. She had been with the district for 14 years, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen troubled children before. Children who lied, children who imagined, children who built entire worlds inside their heads to escape the ones they were born into. She looked at Abby the way people look at broken things they believe they can fix. The hearing, she explained to the room, was not a punishment. It was a student behavioral review, a compassionate intervention designed to address what she called a persistent identity-based delusion. She used those exact words. Clinical. Measured. The kind of language that makes cruelty sound like medicine. One by one, the adults testified. Abby's fourth-grade teacher spoke first. She described a sweet but withdrawn child who had, over the past 2 years, repeatedly made claims about her mother that could not be verified. She had told classmates her mother worked in a big white building. She had once brought a photograph to show and tell, a photo she claimed was taken in the Oval Office, and had grown visibly upset when no one believed her. The teacher's voice softened as she finished. She said she only wanted what was best for Abby. Then came the fifth-grade teacher, who testified that Abby had written multiple assignments referencing her mother's important job, her long absences, her busy schedule. The teacher admitted she had initially dismissed it as a child's fantasy, a coping mechanism, but the persistence had become concerning. The crowd nodded along. Parents exchanged glances. A few of them whispered that they had suspected something was wrong with this child for a long time. Dr. Marsh took over again. She opened her folder and explained, in the patient tone of someone delivering a difficult diagnosis, that children who experience parental absence often construct elaborate fantasies to fill the void. It was not uncommon, she said, for a child to invent a powerful or famous parent. It gave them a sense of importance, a way to explain why their mother or father was never there. She paused and looked at Abby with something that might have been pity. Abby's mother, she continued, was listed in school records as unreachable. Emergency contacts routed to a grandmother. No father on file. The child had been left, for all practical purposes, to raise herself emotionally, and this fantasy, this insistence that her absent mother was somehow the most powerful person in the country, was simply how she had learned to survive. The room murmured in agreement. It made sense to them. It wrapped the situation in a tidy explanation that allowed them to feel sympathetic without feeling guilty. But then Abby spoke. Her voice was small, so small that the people in the back had to lean forward to hear her. She said her mother wasn't absent. She was busy. If this story is hitting you in the chest right now, if you're already feeling what's coming, go ahead and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this moment right here, it's about to turn into something no one in that room saw coming. Now, let's keep going. The room reacted exactly as rooms like that always do. They laughed. Not cruelly, at first. More like the soft, knowing laughter of adults who think they understand something a child cannot. They nodded at each other as if Abby had just confirmed the diagnosis. Busy. Of course she would say that. But then something shifted. A man in the second row, a local councilman who had inserted himself into the proceedings under the pretense of civic concern, leaned forward and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He asked, with a kind of smirk that belonged on a man who had never been told no, whether they were now expected to believe that imaginary presidents were Democrats. The room changed. What had been condescending, laughter became something sharper. Heads turned. Murmurs became mutters. A woman in the back scoffed audibly. Someone else whispered about the state of public education, about indoctrination and fantasies, and what happened when children were allowed to say whatever they wanted without consequence. Abby felt it. The shift. The way the air in the room tightened around her like a closing fist. But she didn't shrink. She looked up, not at the councilman, not at the psychologist, not at any of the adults who had already decided who she was, and she said quietly but clearly that her mother believed in people. For a moment, no one responded. Then the adults exchanged looks. The kind of looks that said this child was too far gone. The kind of looks that sealed decisions before they were ever spoken aloud. Dr. Marsh closed her folder. She recommended, in the formal language of bureaucracy, that Abby's records be amended to reflect a confirmed psychological concern. She recommended ongoing counseling, supervised reintegration into classroom settings, and a formal correction plan to help the child distinguish reality from imagination. She said it gently, as if she were helping. No one objected. But something else happened in that room, something no one noticed. Near the side door, a school security officer stood with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings the way board guards always do. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and read the message twice. His face went pale. He looked toward the back of the room, toward the double doors that led to the parking lot, and then quickly looked away. He said nothing. He didn't move. But his hand, still holding the phone, had begun to tremble. And at the front of the room, Abby sat perfectly still, as if somewhere deep inside she already knew. The wait was almost over. What came next would strip Abby of the last thing she had left, her belief that someone somewhere would see the truth. Because the adults weren't finished. They had evidence now. Documents. Proof that her mother didn't exist at all, at least, not on paper. And when they showed it to the room, even Abby couldn't hold back her tears. The superintendent rose from his seat with the slow, deliberate movements of a man about to deliver what he believed was undeniable truth. He adjusted his glasses. He cleared his throat. And then he reached for a manila folder that had been sitting on the table in front of him since the hearing began. He opened it with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred documents, as if what lay inside would finally put this unfortunate matter to rest. Inside were school records. Transfer documents. Emergency contact forms dating back to when Abby first enrolled in the district as a 6-year-old girl with box braids and a quiet voice and a grandmother who signed every permission slip because her mother was always somewhere else. The superintendent held up one page in particular. He explained, in a tone heavy with manufactured sympathy, that the district had conducted a thorough review of Abby's file. They had searched for any evidence, any shred of documentation, that might support her claims about her mother. They had found something, he said, but it was not what Abby hoped for. According to the official records of the Vancouver School District, Deborah Taylor, the woman Abby claimed was her mother, the woman she insisted was the President of the United States, was listed as deceased. The room gasped. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. But with a soft collective inhale of people who believed they had just witnessed the final piece of a tragic puzzle fall into place. The superintendent continued. He explained that when Abby had transferred into the district years earlier, her mother's information had been incomplete. No working phone number. No verifiable address. No emergency contact that could be reached. And so, following standard protocol for absent or unreachable guardians, a clerical placeholder had been entered into the system. Deceased. It was not meant to be literal, he assured the room. It was simply the way the system handled cases where a parent could not be located or confirmed. A bureaucratic shorthand. A digital way of saying this person does not exist in any way we can reach. He turned to Abby. His voice softened, the way voices soften when adults believe they are being kind while delivering cruelty. He told her that her mother did not exist on paper. That there was no record of Deborah Taylor as a living, reachable, present parent. That whatever Abby believed about her mother, whatever stories she had told herself to cope with the absence, they could not be verified by any document the district possessed. He said it gently, as if gentleness made it true. Abby had held herself together for so long. Through the laughter. Through the testimonies. Through the clinical explanations and the pitying looks and the whispers that followed her like shadows everywhere she went. She had sat still. She had kept her hands folded. She had remembered what her mother taught her about silence and strength and waiting for the right moment. But this was too much. Her shoulders began to shake. Her lips pressed together tight, trying to hold back what could not be held. And then the tears came. Silent. Slow. Rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto her yellow dress with the tiny flowers. She did not sob. She did not wail. She simply cried the way children cry when they have run out of words, when the adults around them have made it clear that nothing they say will ever be believed. Family, if this moment is breaking your heart the way it's breaking mine, I need you to do something for me. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens next in this story, I promise you, no one in that room saw coming. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that bell. Join this family. Because we're not done. The parents in the audience shifted uncomfortably. A few of them whispered that this was sad, that they felt sorry for the girl, that someone should have intervened earlier, before the delusion had taken such deep root. But none of them said she was telling the truth. None of them stood up. None of them walked to that table, knelt beside her, and told her she was not alone. They watched. They murmured. And then they looked away. One woman, a school board member who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, leaned toward the superintendent and spoke in a low voice that still carried across the quiet room. She suggested that given the circumstances, it might be appropriate to initiate a foster care evaluation. A welfare check at the very least. The child clearly had no stable parental figure, and allowing her to continue living in a fantasy could cause irreparable psychological harm. The superintendent nodded slowly. Dr. Marsh made a note in her folder. And Abby, still crying, still trembling, still alone at that too-big table, did not see what happened next. At the back of the hall, a woman stepped forward. She had been standing in the shadows near the rear entrance for several minutes now, unnoticed by the crowd that was too focused on the spectacle at the front of the room. She wore white, an elegant understated dress that seemed almost to glow beneath the fluorescent lights. Her posture was straight. Her expression was unreadable. Her eyes never left her daughter. No one turned to look at her. Not yet. But the security officer near the side door had seen her. His face was pale. His phone was still clutched in his hand. And when the woman in white took another step forward, he instinctively pressed himself against the wall, as if making room for something far larger than himself. Still, no one noticed. Instead, one of Abby's former teachers, a woman who had once given her a gold star for reading above her grade level, leaned into her microphone and spoke the words that would echo through history. She said with the smug certainty of someone who believed herself compassionate, that if Abby's mother were really the president, if any of this were true, then she would be here. The room murmured in agreement. Abby looked up through her tears. And somewhere behind her, the woman in white smiled. What no one understood, what no one could have possibly anticipated, was that Abby's mother had been there the entire time. Watching. Waiting. Letting them reveal exactly who they were. And now, she was ready to move. She had learned, long ago, how to disappear in plain sight. It was one of the first lessons she mastered after taking office, the art of standing in a room full of people without being seen. Not through disguise. Not through hiding. But through stillness. Through becoming so calm, so composed, so utterly unremarkable in her silence, that the human eye simply passed over her like light over glass. Deborah Taylor stood at the back of the Vancouver School District Civic Hall, and not a single person in that room knew who she was. They were too busy watching her daughter cry. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier, slipping through a side entrance while the psychologist was explaining the mechanics of childhood delusion. 2 agents had entered with her, both dressed in plain clothes, both positioned near the exits with the practiced casualness of people who were trained to look like they belonged anywhere. 4 more waited outside. Another 6 sat in the black SUVs that lined the parking lot, engines idling, windows dark. She had given strict orders. No one was to move until she gave the signal. No one was to intervene. No one was to reveal anything, not until these people had shown her exactly who they were. And oh, how they had shown her. She had watched the superintendent hold up her daughter's essay like a piece of evidence. She had listened to the teachers testify with their rehearsed concern. She had heard the psychologist explain, in that soft and clinical voice, how children invented powerful parents to cope with abandonment, and she had felt something tighten in her chest that she had not felt in years. Not anger. Something colder. Deborah Taylor was not a woman who lost control. She had stood in rooms with world leaders who tried to intimidate her. She had faced congressional hearings designed to break her. She had delivered addresses to the nation in moments of crisis, while her hands remained perfectly steady and her voice never wavered. But watching her daughter sit alone at that table, watching Abby's small shoulders shake as she cried in front of 200 strangers who had already decided she was broken, that required a different kind of strength. The kind that waits. The kind that watches. The kind that lets the guilty reveal themselves completely before justice arrives. She shifted her weight slightly. One of the agents near the left exit glanced in her direction, a silent check-in. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. Not yet. But soon. At the front of the room, the teacher who had just spoken, the one who had declared that if Abby's mother were really president, she would be here, sat back in her chair with a satisfied expression. The crowd murmured in agreement. The superintendent began shuffling papers, preparing to move toward the formal recommendation phase. No one noticed the subtle movements happening around them. An agent near the main entrance adjusted his jacket. Another stepped closer to the side door. A third, stationed near the windows, pressed a finger to his earpiece and whispered something too quiet to hear. Outside, car doors opened and closed in soft succession. Footsteps gathered on concrete. Abby felt it before she understood it. Something had changed. The air in the room had shifted, grown heavier, somehow, like the stillness before a storm. The fluorescent lights hummed the same as before. The adults were still talking. The superintendent was still holding her file. But something was different. She stopped crying. Not because the pain had passed. Not because she had suddenly found strength. But because somewhere deep in her chest, in that quiet place where she kept her prayers and her stubborn, unshakable belief, she felt a presence. Familiar. Close. She lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face turning toward the back of the room, her eyes scanning the rows of adults who had come to watch her be corrected. And then she saw her. Family, I need you to pause for just a second. If you're feeling the shift right now, if your heart is starting to beat a little faster, then you already know something is about to happen. Go ahead and hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me if you saw this coming. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens in the next chapter is going to change everything. All right. Let's keep going. The woman in white stood perfectly still at the back of the hall. She did not wave. She did not smile. She did not call out or make any gesture that might draw attention. She simply stood there, calm, composed, radiating a quiet authority that seemed to bend the light around her. Abby's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world fell away. The superintendent's voice became distant. The murmurs of the crowd faded into silence. There was only the woman in white, and the certainty, spreading through Abby's chest like warmth, that everything was about to change. The woman took one step forward. Just one. And then the doors at the back of the hall clicked shut. The sound was soft, barely audible over the hum of conversation, but it cut through the room like a blade. Heads turned. A few people near the back glanced toward the exits with mild confusion. Someone tried to push open one of the side doors and found it locked. The murmurs shifted. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Parents exchanged glances. The councilman who had mocked Abby earlier straightened in his seat, his smirk fading into something uncertain. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt it. The superintendent paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. Dr. Marsh looked up from her folder. The security officer near the side door, the one who had gone pale earlier, pressed himself further against the wall, his eyes fixed on the back of the room. And then they heard it. Footsteps. Not scattered. Not random. But synchronized, precise and deliberate, echoing through the hallway beyond the locked doors like a drumbeat building toward thunder. Closer. Closer. The room fell silent. Abby turned back toward the front of the hall, her tears drying on her cheeks. And for the first time since the hearing began, she smiled. The doors were about to open. And when they did, every person in that room, every adult who had laughed, every official who had testified, every parent who had whispered that this was sad but never once said it was wrong, would understand the mistake they had made. They had called a child a liar. They were about to meet her mother. The doors opened. Not slowly. Not hesitantly. But with the decisive force of authority that does not ask permission and does not explain itself. The sound cut through the silence like a crack of thunder, both doors swinging wide at exactly the same moment, slamming against the walls with a finality that made every person in that room freeze exactly where they sat. And then they came. The agents moved like a choreographed unit, 6 of them entering simultaneously, 3 from each door, their movements synchronized with a kind of precision that can only come from years of training and absolute certainty of purpose. They wore dark suits, earpieces, expressions that revealed nothing and missed nothing. Their eyes swept the room in overlapping patterns, cataloging exits, identifying threats, assessing every face in under 3 seconds. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply flooded the space with a presence so commanding that the entire room seemed to shrink around them. The The superintendent's mouth fell open mid-sentence. Dr. Marsh dropped her pen. The councilman in the second row, the one who had smirked about imaginary Democrat presidents, went white as paper. Parents twisted in their seats, trying to understand what they were seeing. Someone near the back stood up as if to leave, but an agent turned his gaze toward them and they sat back down immediately, hands trembling. No one moved. No one breathed. And then a voice cut through the hall, calm, clear, and utterly immovable. United States Secret Service. This proceeding is over. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed in the room like a gavel struck by the hand of God himself. Final, inarguable, absolute. A phone slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the floor. Another followed. Then another. The soft percussion of plastic hitting tile spread through the rows as people scrambled to put down their devices, as if holding them had suddenly become a crime. Someone had been recording. The red light blinked once, twice, and then the phone was shoved into a pocket with shaking hands. Near the front, a school board member, an older man who had sat through the entire hearing with the bored expression of someone who had seen troubled children before, knocked over a cup of coffee in his rush to stand. The liquid spread across the table in a dark, silent stain. He didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the agents now positioned at every exit. There was panic in the room. But it was not chaos. It was the kind of panic that happens when people realize, all at once, that they are no longer in control, that the rules they thought governed this space have just been rewritten by a power so far above them they hadn't even known it existed. Dr. Marsh tried to speak. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. The superintendent raised one trembling hand as if to object, to ask for clarification, to assert some shred of the authority he had wielded so confidently just moments before. An agent looked at him. The hand lowered. And then the woman in white began to walk. She moved down the center aisle with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who had walked into hostile rooms before and turned them silent with nothing but her presence. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, a steady rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the entire building had gone quiet just to listen. The agents shifted as she passed, repositioning themselves with fluid precision. Two fell in behind her. One moved to the front of the room. Another stepped between the crowd and the table where Abby sat. People stared. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. She was just a woman in a white dress. Calm. Composed. Walking toward the front of the hall like she had every right to be there. But then slowly, in scattered moments of recognition that rippled through the room like a wave gathering strength, they began to realize. A woman in the third row gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. A teacher near the aisle leaned forward, eyes widening, lips forming a name she didn't dare speak aloud. The councilman's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of his chair so hard his knuckles went bone-white. Someone whispered it first. Just a breath. Just a name carried on the air like something fragile and dangerous all at once. Deborah Taylor. And then the room understood. Family, if you're watching this right now and your heart is pounding, if you felt that shift the moment those doors opened, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to see what happens when the truth walks into the room. And if you haven't subscribed, do it now. Because we are not done yet. The woman in white did not acknowledge the whispers. She did not pause. She did not offer explanations or introductions or any of the performative gestures that people expected from power. She simply walked to the front of the room, past the rows of parents who had come to watch a child be humiliated, past the teachers who had testified against her daughter's truth, past the psychologist with her folder full of clinical certainties, past the superintendent still holding the damning essay in his trembling hands. And she stopped beside Abby. The entire room held its breath. Deborah Taylor looked down at her daughter, at the little girl in the yellow dress with the tear-streaked face and the box braids tied back with a white ribbon, and she did something no one in that room expected. She smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a vindictive one. Just the soft, private smile of a mother who had been gone too long and was finally home. Then she placed one hand on Abby's shoulder. The touch was gentle, protective, anchoring. Abby looked up at her mother, and the tears that had been falling just moments before stopped. Her breathing steadied. Her hands, which had been clenched so tightly in her lap, slowly relaxed. Deborah Taylor turned to face the room. 200 people stared back at her. Superintendents and psychologists, teachers and parents, a councilman who had mocked a child for telling the truth, and a security officer who was still pressed against the wall near the side door, his face pale and his phone clutched uselessly in his hand. No one spoke. No one moved. The President of the United States stood in front of them all, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, and said the only thing that needed to be said. "She told you the truth." Her voice was quiet, calm, measured, but it carried. It filled every corner of that hall, settled into every silence, wrapped around every person who had laughed or whispered or testified or simply sat and watched while a 10-year-old girl was called delusional for knowing exactly who her mother was. Abby stopped crying. The room stayed frozen. And in the silence that followed, thick and heavy and absolute, not a single person dared to breathe. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with shame and shock and the slow, creeping realization that every person in that room had just made a mistake they would carry for the rest of their lives. Deborah Taylor did not move. Her hand remained steady on Abby's shoulder. Her expression stayed calm, not cold, not angry, but clear. The kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty. The kind that does not need volume to be heard. She let the silence settle. Let it press down on the room like weight on a scale, measuring exactly how much each person had contributed to this moment. The superintendent, still frozen at the front with Abby's essay clutched in his hands. The psychologist, her folder open on the table, her clinical explanations now exposed as assumptions built on nothing but absence. The teachers who had testified. The parents who had whispered. The councilman who had smirked. All of them sitting in a room they thought they controlled. All of them realizing, too late, that they never had. When President Taylor finally spoke again, her voice was quiet. Steady. The tone of someone who had stood before Congress, before world leaders, before crowds of thousands, and learned long ago that power did not need to shout to be understood. She told them she had been gone often. That her daughter had spent years with her grandmother, because the work she did required sacrifices most people would never be asked to make. She did not apologize for it. She did not justify it. She simply stated it, the way someone states a fact that exists whether or not it is convenient. She explained that Abby had been raised to understand that service meant absence. That leadership required time. That her mother loved her completely and was often, necessarily, somewhere else. And she said that absence did not make a child a liar. The words landed like stones in still water. A few people lowered their heads. One of the teachers, the one who had testified about Abby's persistent claims, covered her face with her hands. Someone in the back row stood as if to leave, then thought better of it and sat back down trembling. President Taylor did not raise her voice. She did not pace. She did not point or accuse or perform the kind of anger people expected from power when it had been wronged. She simply looked at the room, at the 200 people who had gathered to correct a child, and named exactly what had happened. You interrogated a child because her truth made you uncomfortable. The words did not echo. They didn't need to. They sank into the room like truth always does when it is spoken plainly, undeniable, inescapable, sharp enough to cut but too precise to be called cruel. She continued, her voice still calm, still measured. She said that Abby had told them exactly who her mother was. That she had offered them the truth in an essay written in careful handwriting with proud, unguarded honesty. And instead of believing her, instead of checking, instead of pausing, instead of considering for even one moment that a child might know her own life better than the adults who had decided to dissect it, they had turned her truth into a diagnosis. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not agreement. Not protest. Just the low, uncomfortable sound of people who know they have been seen clearly and do not like what the mirror shows. Dr. Marsh opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Her folder sat open in front of her, full of theories about invented parents and identity-based illusions and coping mechanisms, all of it now reduced to what it had always been. Guesswork. Dressed up as expertise. President Taylor turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the front row, past the teachers, past the school board members, until it landed on the councilman in the second row. The man who had smirked. The man who had asked, with that tone people use when they think they're being clever, whether imaginary presidents were now Democrats. He was pale. Sweating. Gripping the edge of his chair like it might save him. It would not. President Taylor did not speak to him. She did not acknowledge him. She simply looked at him for one long silent moment, and then she gave the smallest nod. An agent moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just a calm, deliberate approach. The agent stopped beside the councilman's chair, leaned down, and spoke in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. The councilman's face went from pale to gray. He stood on shaking legs. The agent gestured toward the side exit. And without a word, without protest, without the smug certainty he had carried into this room, the councilman walked toward the door flanked by 2 Secret Service agents who moved with him like shadows. The door opened. He stepped through. The door closed. He was gone. The room watched in stunned silence. A woman in the 3rd row whispered something to the person beside her, but the words died in her throat when another agent turned his gaze in her direction. No one else spoke. And then near the front, a school board member, an older woman who had sat through the entire hearing with her hands folded and her expression neutral, went suddenly terribly still. Her face lost all color. Her eyes rolled back. And she fainted. The sound of her body hitting the floor was soft but final. 2 people rushed to her side. Someone called for water. An agent spoke quietly into his radio, and within seconds, a medic appeared from somewhere outside, moving through the side door with the calm efficiency of someone who had been waiting nearby just in case. President Taylor did not react. She had seen people faint before, in courtrooms, in press conferences, in moments when the weight of reality became too much to carry while standing. She simply waited. And then she turned back to her daughter. Abby was still sitting in the chair, her feet dangling above the floor, her hands no longer folded tight but resting loosely in her lap. Her tears had dried. Her breathing was steady. And when her mother knelt beside her, when President Deborah Taylor lowered herself to her daughter's level and opened her arms, Abby did not hesitate. She leaned forward and let herself be lifted. Her mother held her the way mothers hold children who have been alone too long. Gently. Protectively. Like something precious that should never have been put on trial in the first place. Abby rested her head on her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes. And for the first time in hours, she felt safe. If this moment just hit you, if you're feeling everything Abby is feeling right now, I need you to share this story. Send it to someone. Post it. Let people know what happens when the truth finally gets to speak. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Hit that bell. Stay with us. Because this story isn't finished yet. President Taylor stood, her daughter held securely in her arms, and turned to face the room one final time. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked at the administrators, the teachers, the parents, the psychologist with her useless folder, and the superintendent still frozen at the front of the hall. And she said, in that same calm, unshakable voice, "This is not a discipline issue. This is a failure of belief." The words settled over the room like a final verdict. No one responded. No one moved. They simply sat in the wreckage of what they had done, surrounded by agents, watched by the woman they had tried to erase, holding the child they had tried to break. And the silence, thick, absolute, and unforgiving, stayed frozen around them. The footage hit the internet 47 minutes after the doors of the Civic Hall opened. Someone had been recording. Despite the phones that clattered to the floor when the Secret Service entered, despite the fear that filled that room like water rising in a sealed chamber, someone had kept their camera running. Hidden in a pocket, propped against a purse, angled just enough to capture the woman in white walking down that aisle, her hand settling on her daughter's shoulder, her voice steady and damning as she spoke 5 words that would rewrite the news cycle for weeks. She told you the truth. By the time President Taylor's motorcade pulled away from the Vancouver School District building, the video had been shared 6,000 times. By the time Abby was buckled into the back seat beside her mother, her small hand wrapped tightly in her mother's larger one, the clip had reached 100,000 views. By the time they arrived at the secure location where Abby's grandmother waited with open arms and tears streaming down her face, the video had gone viral. Not just trending. Not just popular. Viral in the way that only truth, raw, undeniable, impossible to look away from, can be. The world watched a 10-year-old girl cry in front of 200 adults who had gathered to call her delusional. They watched her sit alone at a table too big for her feet dangling, her shoulders shaking. They watched the superintendent hold up her essay like evidence. They heard the laughter, the clinical explanations, the smug declaration that if her mother were really the president, she would be here. And then they watched the doors open. They watched the agents flood the room with that terrifying precision. They watched the woman in white move through the frozen crowd like a force of nature contained in human form. They watched her stop beside her daughter, place a hand on her shoulder, and speak the truth those adults had refused to believe. And the world reacted exactly the way the world always does. It split. The headlines came fast, from every news outlet, every blog, every commentator with a platform and an opinion. Some of them led with outrage. President's daughter subjected to public humiliation, school district under fire. Others framed it as vindication. Mother arrives just in time. Secret Service ends illegal interrogation of 10-year-old. But then the other headlines appeared. The ones that twisted the story into something else entirely. Political stunt or parental negligence. President uses daughter's school hearing for optics. Another read, Democrat president storms school board meeting, overreach or justice. The split was predictable. Inevitable. The kind of division that had come to define every moment of national attention, where facts mattered less than which side you stood on before you ever heard them. But underneath the politics, beneath the partisan noise, something else was happening. People were watching that little girl cry, and they were asking why no one stopped it. Family, if you're still with me, if you're feeling this in your chest right now, I need you to do something. Share this story. Not because it's entertaining, but because it matters. Because somewhere, someone needs to see what happens when a child's truth is dismissed. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. And stay with me, because we're not done yet. Within 24 hours, the superintendent resigned. He released a statement through the district's communications office, a carefully worded apology that mentioned regret and procedural review and a commitment to doing better. It said nothing about why a child had been put on trial in the first place. It said nothing about the 200 people who had come to watch. It said nothing about the laughter. But it didn't matter what the statement said. He was gone. The school district followed with their own apology. It was longer, more detailed, filled with the language institutions use when they've been caught, words like unfortunate, miscommunication, lack of proper protocol. They promised an independent review. They promised policy changes. They promised it would never happen again. They did not apologize to Abby by name. They apologized to the family affected by this incident, as if naming her would make it real in a way they weren't ready to face. 2 days later, Congress announced an inquiry. Not into the school district. Not into the superintendent or the psychologist or the councilman who had been quietly escorted out and had not been seen in public since. Into the systems that allowed it to happen. A bipartisan committee, an almost unheard-of phrase in a capital city that had forgotten how to agree on anything, announced they would be investigating how schools handle parental absence, how children in federal families are protected, and how public institutions respond when a child's truth doesn't fit their expectations. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Witnesses were being called. Records were being subpoenaed. And through it all, Abby's face was everywhere. Not because she was the president's daughter. Not because of power or politics or the spectacle of Secret Service agents storming a small-town school hearing. But because she had become something bigger. A symbol. Not of privilege. Not of access. But of every child who had ever told the truth and been called a liar. Every kid who knew their own story and had been told by adults they were confused. Every young voice that had been dismissed because the truth they carried made someone uncomfortable. Abby's face, tear-streaked, small, sitting alone at that table, became the image people saw when they thought about belief. About who gets listened to. About what happens when institutions decide they know better than the child sitting in front of them. And President Deborah Taylor did not shield a single person from accountability. When her press secretary suggested they let the matter fade quietly, she refused. When political advisors warned that prolonged attention might hurt her approval ratings, she told them ratings were not her concern. When a coalition of education lobbyists requested a private meeting to discuss de-escalation, she declined. She did not go on television and demand resignations. She did not deliver fiery speeches or call for heads to roll. She simply made it clear in statements in press briefings, in the way her administration cooperated fully with the congressional inquiry, that what happened to her daughter was not going to be buried, smoothed over, or explained away. There would be accountability. Not because she was powerful, but because it was right. And then, on a Tuesday morning exactly 2 weeks after the hearing, Abby went back to school. The sight was surreal. 2 black SUVs pulled up to the entrance of her elementary school just before the first bell rang. Parents in the drop-off line froze, their cars idling, their children pressed against windows to see what was happening. The back door of the second SUV opened, and Abby stepped out. She wore her backpack. Her box braids were tied back with a blue ribbon this time. She looked like any other 10-year-old girl heading to class, except for the 3 Secret Service agents who flanked her on either side. Not hovering. Not crowding. Just there. Present. A quiet reminder that this child, this girl who had been interrogated in a public hall for telling the truth, would not be walking into any room unprotected ever again. Abby walked up the steps to the main entrance. The agents followed at a respectful distance. One of them opened the door. And Abby Taylor, daughter of the president, survivor of a hearing that should never have happened, symbol of every dismissed truth, walked back into her school with her head held high. The door closed behind her. The cameras kept rolling. And across the country, millions of people watched and wondered what would happen next. The address was scheduled for 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. Prime time. Maximum reach. The kind of slot reserved for moments when a president needed the entire country to stop what they were doing and listen. The White House communications team had pushed for it to happen sooner, wanted to capitalize on the momentum while the story was still burning hot across every platform, every network, every dinner table conversation in America. But President Taylor had refused to be rushed. She told them she would speak when she was ready. She would speak when Abby was ready. And she would speak when she had something to say that mattered more than the news cycle. So they waited. And while they waited, the country kept talking. Think pieces flooded the internet. Educators debated on panels. Parents argued in comment sections about whether the school district had been trying to help or harm, whether the hearing had been intervention or interrogation, whether a child should ever be subjected to public questioning about their family, no matter who that family was. Some defended the teachers. Said they were doing their jobs. Said they had no way of knowing. Said the whole thing was a tragedy of miscommunication. Others called it what it was. Cruelty dressed up as concern. And through it all, Abby went to school. Came home. Did her homework at the kitchen table while her grandmother made dinner and Secret Service agents rotated shifts outside. She didn't watch the news. Her mother made sure of that. But she knew people were talking about her. She could feel it in the way her classmates looked at her now. Not with mockery. Not anymore. But with something else. Something cautious and curious and uncertain. Like they didn't know whether to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. Most of them chose silence. But one girl, a quiet kid named Sarah who sat 2 rows over and had never spoken to Abby before, slipped her a note during math. It said, "I believe you now. I'm sorry I didn't before." Abby kept that note in her pocket for 3 days. On the evening of the address, Abby sat in the front row of the East Room, wearing the same yellow dress with the tiny flowers. Her grandmother sat beside her, holding her hand. A few members of the cabinet were there. The vice president. A handful of carefully selected guests, including 2 child psychologists who had spent their careers advocating for children's rights, and a teacher from Ohio who had been fired for refusing to participate in a similar hearing 3 years earlier. The cameras were positioned. The lights were set. The teleprompter was loaded with a speech that had been written, rewritten, and finally scrapped entirely 2 hours before airtime. President Taylor would speak from notes. Handwritten. In her own words. At exactly 8 o'clock, the red lights on the cameras blinked on. And President Deborah Taylor stepped up to the podium. She wore navy blue. Simple. Professional. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except for a small pin on her lapel, a silver ribbon that had been given to her years ago by a group of children advocating for foster care reform. She looked directly into the camera. And she began. Family, if your heart is pounding right now, if you can feel the weight of what's about to be said, I need you to hit that like button. I need you to share this story. Because what happens in the next few minutes is going to change the way we see children, truth, and power. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications. And stay with me. Good evening. 2 weeks ago, my daughter sat in a room full of adults who did not believe her. She told them the truth. She told them who I was. She told them what our family looked like, the absences, the sacrifices, the complicated reality of a mother who serves her country and loves her child and is often, necessarily, somewhere else. And they called her delusional. President Taylor paused. Not for effect. But because the words required space. Required breath. They did not do this in private. They did not pull her aside with gentle questions and genuine concern. They called a hearing. They invited 200 people. They asked her teachers to testify. They brought in a psychologist to explain, in clinical terms, how a child might invent a powerful parent to cope with abandonment. And when my 10-year-old daughter told them, again, that her mother was the President of the United States, they laughed. Her voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It stayed calm, measured, clear. But the silence in the East Room was absolute. I was not there when the hearing started. I arrived partway through. And I made a choice that some of you may not understand. I waited. I stood at the back of that room, and I watched. I watched them hold up her essay like it was evidence of illness. I watched them present school records that listed me as deceased, a clerical placeholder, they called it, as if erasing a parent on paper was simply an administrative inconvenience. I watched my daughter cry. And I waited, because I needed to see exactly who they were. I needed to know what they would do when they believed no one was watching. When they believed there would be no consequences. And they showed me. She looked down at her notes. Not because she needed them, but because the next part required steadiness. I want to be very clear about something. This is not about me. This is not about my position, my office, or my authority. What happened to my daughter was wrong, but it was not wrong because of who I am. It was wrong because she is a child. And children deserve to be believed. The words settled over the room like stones dropped into still water. My daughter was not protected because of who I am. She was questioned because of who I am. Because the adults in that room could not reconcile the truth she was telling them with the assumptions they had already made. They saw a black girl. They saw an absent mother. They saw paperwork that didn't add up. And instead of investigating further, instead of asking better questions, instead of considering for even a moment that this child might know her own life, they built a narrative, a fantasy, a delusion, a coping mechanism. They turned her truth into a diagnosis. And then they put her on trial for it. President Taylor lifted her gaze back to the camera. I am not here tonight to shame those individuals. Many of them, I believe, thought they were helping. They thought they were protecting a child from harm. But intention does not erase impact. And the impact on my daughter, and on every child who has ever been dismissed because their truth was inconvenient, is what we must address. She took a breath. Tonight, I am announcing a new executive initiative, the Children's Truth and Dignity Protection Act. This initiative will establish federal guidelines to protect minors from public institutional interrogation without parental consent or legal representation. It will require schools, social services, and any public agency working with children to implement trauma-informed practices when questions of family structure or parental involvement arise. It will mandate that before any child is subjected to a formal review, a hearing, or any public proceeding that questions their credibility, there must be verification, documentation, and due process. And it will ensure that no child is ever again put in a position where 200 adults gather to watch them defend their own existence. The room was silent. This is not about politics. It is not about left or right, Democrat or Republican, progressive or conservative. It is about recognizing that children are not puzzles to be solved by people who think they know better. They are human beings. With voices, with truths, with lives that belong to them, not to the institutions that serve them. President Taylor glanced down at the front row. At Abby. Her daughter sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide and locked on her mother. And President Taylor smiled, just slightly. My daughter told the truth. And she was punished for it. That will not happen again. Not to her. And if I have anything to say about it, not to any child in this country. She straightened the papers in front of her, though she had barely looked at them. We will do better. We must do better. Because our children are watching. And they deserve to know that when they tell us the truth, we will believe them. She paused one final time. Thank you. Good night. And to every child who has ever been told their truth was too big to be real, I see you. The camera's red light blinked off. And in living rooms, classrooms, break rooms, and kitchens across the country, millions of people sat in silence, some with tears on their faces, some with clenched fists, some nodding slowly as if they had been waiting their whole lives to hear someone say it. Children deserve to be believed. In the East Room, Abby stood up from her seat. She walked to the podium. And her mother, the President of the United States, knelt down and pulled her into her arms. The press pool captured the image. It would be on the front page of every major newspaper by morning. But in that moment, none of that mattered. It was just a mother. And her daughter. And a promise kept. If this moment just broke you open, if you felt every word of that speech, share this story. Right now. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because we have one more truth that needs to be told. The classroom looked exactly the same as it had before. Same pale green walls. Same alphabet chart above the whiteboard, its edges curled from years of use. Same rows of desks arranged in neat lines. Same morning light filtering through windows that hadn't been cleaned since September. Same hum of the ancient heating system that kicked on every 12 minutes like clockwork. Everything was the same. Except it wasn't. Abby stood in the doorway on Monday morning, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her box braids tied back with a purple ribbon today. Behind her, at a respectful distance, a Secret Service agent stood with his hands clasped in front of him, expression neutral, eyes constantly scanning. He would not enter the classroom. Those were the rules her mother had established. Abby would have protection, but she would not have spectacle. She would be allowed to be a child. The other students were already in their seats. 23 of them. Kids she had known since kindergarten. Kids who had laughed when she read her essay aloud. Kids who had whispered about her in a hallway. Kids who had decided she was either lying or broken and had treated her accordingly. But when Abby walked into that classroom, no one laughed. They simply looked at her. Not with mockery. Not with pity. But with something else, something uncertain and careful and new. Like they were seeing her for the first time and didn't quite know what to say. Sarah, the girl who had slipped Abby the note during math, offered a small tentative smile. Another boy, Tyler, who had once called her story crazy during recess, looked down at his desk quickly, his face flushed. Abby walked to her seat in the third row, second from the window. The same seat she had sat in every day for 5 months. She set her backpack down, pulled out her notebook, arranged her pencils the way she always did, perfectly straight, erasers aligned. And slowly, quietly, the room exhaled. Mrs. Brennan stood at the front of the classroom. She was younger than most of the teachers at the school, only her 4th year teaching, and she had not been one of the ones who testified at the hearing. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't contributed to the narrative that Abby was delusional. But she also hadn't stopped it. She had stood on the sidelines, uncertain and silent, while a 10-year-old girl was put on trial by people who should have protected her. And that silence, that careful conflict-avoidant silence, had hollowed her out over the past 2 weeks in ways she was still learning to name. She cleared her throat softly. The class turned to look at her. And Mrs. Brennan did something that teachers almost never do in front of their students. She apologized. Not with excuses. Not with justifications or explanations about how complicated the situation had been or how she hadn't known all the facts. She simply looked at Abby, directly, unflinchingly, and said she was sorry. She said she should have listened better. She said she should have believed her. She said she had failed in the most important job a teacher has, to protect the truth a child brings into the room, no matter how impossible it seems. Her voice cracked on the last part. And Abby, sitting in the third row with her pencils perfectly aligned, nodded once. A small, simple acknowledgement that the apology had been heard. It didn't erase what had happened. But it mattered. If this is hitting you right now, if you understand the power of an apology that doesn't make excuses, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because we're almost at the end, and you don't want to miss how this story closes. The day moved forward the way school days always do. Math worksheets. A spelling test. A read-aloud session where Mrs. Brennan stumbled over words she had read 100 times before because she was still shaking slightly, still carrying the weight of what she had said in front of 23 witnesses who would remember it forever. At lunch, Abby sat with Sarah. Not because they were best friends. Not because everything was suddenly fine. But because Sarah had been the first one to say "I believe you now," and that mattered more than Abby knew how to explain. 2 other girls joined them. Then a boy from the back row. Then another. Not a crowd. Not a spectacle. Just kids who were slowly, cautiously learning how to sit beside the truth instead of turning away from it. By the end of the day, Abby had spoken more words than she had in the entire month before the hearing. She was still quiet. Still careful. Still carrying the weight of what had happened in that civic hall. But she was no longer invisible. On Friday, Mrs. Brennan assigned a new essay. The prompt was simple: what I believe in. Abby stared at the blank page in front of her for a long time. She thought about writing about her mother again. About power, about the presidency, about what it meant to be the daughter of someone the world watched. But that wasn't the story she needed to tell anymore. She picked up her pencil. And she began to write. She wrote about what it felt like to tell the truth and not be believed. She wrote about sitting in a room full of adults who had already decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. She wrote about the moment the doors opened and her mother walked in, not because her mother was the president, but because her mother had promised she would always come. And then she wrote about something else. She wrote about the kids in her class who looked at her differently now. About Sarah's note. About Mrs. Brennan's apology. About the way belief could be rebuilt, one small moment at a time, by people who chose to try. She didn't write about power. She wrote about belief. About the fragile, stubborn, necessary act of trusting that someone's truth is real, even when it doesn't fit the story you expected. When she finished, she read it over once. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her notebook. This one, she decided, was just for her. Family, if you've stayed with me this whole way, if you felt every moment of Abby's journey, I need you to do something. Share this story. Not because it's trending. Not because it's dramatic. But because somewhere, someone needs to know that their truth matters. Hit that like button. Subscribe. And drop a comment telling me what this story meant to you. 3 months later, the Children's Truth and Dignity Protection Act passed with bipartisan support. It wasn't perfect. It would need amendments, revisions, challenges and defenses in courts across the country. But it was a start. A line drawn in the sand that said children deserved more than assumptions. They deserved belief, verification, and protection. School districts across the country began implementing new policies. Training sessions on trauma-informed practices. Protocols for parental verification before any public review. Mandatory legal representation for minors subjected to institutional questioning. The Vancouver School District became a case study, not in failure, but in what happens when systems are forced to reckon with the harm they cause. And Abby Taylor became something she never asked to be. A symbol. Not of power. Not of privilege. But of every child who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or told that their truth was too complicated to be real. Her face, the image of her sitting alone at that table, tears streaming down her cheeks, became a reminder. A call to do better. On a Saturday in early spring, Abby stood on the steps of the White House, her hand tucked securely in her mother's. They were walking toward the South Lawn, where a small gathering had assembled: educators, child advocates, representatives from the congressional committee that had pushed the new protections into law. Abby wore her yellow dress again. The one with the tiny flowers. The one she had worn the day her world broke open and then, impossibly, was put back together. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. Abby looked up at her and smiled. Not the tentative, uncertain smile of a child who had learned to be afraid of rooms full of adults, but the smile of a girl who had told the truth, been vindicated, and was learning, slowly, carefully, that her voice mattered. They walked together across the lawn, mother and daughter, president and child, two people who had survived a moment designed to break them and had come through it stronger. Behind them, the cameras captured the image. But ahead of them, the future waited. A future where truth would no longer be dismissed because of who said it. A future where children would be believed, not because of who their parents were, but because belief was the foundation of everything that mattered. A future where no one would laugh. Not this time. Not ever again. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If this story touched you, changed you, or reminded you of something you needed to hear, share it. Subscribe to this channel. And remember, every voice matters. Every truth deserves to be heard. I'll see you in the next story, family. Until then, keep believing.